I want to talk today a little bit about prayer. In the gospel reading, there was a passage that said, the last part of the passage said, "This is the assurance we have in approaching God, that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. And if we know that he hears us, whatever we ask, we know that we have what we asked of him." So, we know God hears us. As Christians, that's promised, but only as we ask in his will. I remember years and years ago, the song, "Lord, I want a Mercedes-Benz. My friends all have Porsches. I must make amends." Remember that? "Lord, I want a color TV. Dialing for dollars is trying to find me." Remember that song? That's not the kind of prayer that we're talking about here. We're talking about things that are in the will of God. And maybe if you need a job and you don't have a car, it would be appropriate to pray for a car, but not a Mercedes-Benz, right? Or a Porsche. Porsche. We have to temper our prayers with reality, with what would be in the will of God. Do you remember Pat Robertson many, many years ago making a famous statement that just aggravated the media to death when he said, "God does not hear the prayers of sinners"? Remember that? And it was a big deal for about 6 months. The news picked up on this, and you couldn't hardly watch any discussion on TV without somebody bringing up, what about this idea that God doesn't hear prayer? Does he hear prayer of sinners? Well, obviously he does, or none of us would be Christians. Because we're brought into a relationship through the Holy Spirit and prayer. There's prayer behind every person who comes to know Christ. There's prayer involved in everything that would relate to our relationship with Christ. So it's very important, even if you're not a Christian, to be able to pray. And we do have some examples in the Old Testament of that. We have Elijah going to the Syrophoenician woman and her son, as she's getting ready to take the last bit of oil and meal she has in the home, and she's getting ready to make her last little pieces of bread, one for her son and one for her, and they planned on dying. And the prophet comes and he says, "Well, instead of you doing that, why don't you take a third of it and give it to me?" And she made a very strange answer. She said, "As your God lives, I will do it." Very strange coming from a pagan. But she had an idea, she knew of the God of Israel. And she hoped that the God of Israel would intervene somehow in her doing this. Can you imagine, it doesn't mention prayer once in this story, but can you imagine this woman not having been crying out to God because they're down to their last meal and they're going to die of starvation? Would you be crying out to God? God comes, sends the prophet, and the prophet reveals to her that the God of Israel is truly God. Because he tells her, yes, go ahead and do this, and if you do it, you'll not run out of meal, and you'll not run out of oil until this drought is over, which lasted for 3 years in the land. You will not die. You will have food. And the woman says, "As the God of Israel lives, I will do it." And the God of Israel truly lived, didn't he? Because for 3 years, she had food and oil, grain and oil, and her and her son and the prophet who moved in to her spare room lived with them. And then her son dies during this 3-year period. And it tests the faith that she has been nurturing, and she cries out to God and to the prophet, "Why have you allowed this to happen? I did what you wanted. I gave up my food. I've kept care of the prophet, and my son dies." And the prophet raised him from the dead to really confirm to her that there's a God in Israel. We jump ahead to his successor, Elisha, not Elijah, but Elisha. And we find the story of a general from Syria, who the king in Syria learns from a Jewish girl that there's a prophet in Israel can heal him. And the king writes up this nice little letter and sends it to the king of Israel and says, "I want you to heal my servant, my general." And the king of Israel panics and says, "How am I supposed to heal anybody?" And then he realizes that the prophet can do it. And so he sends him to the prophet, hoping this happens because he doesn't want a war with Syria. And the prophet refuses to come out and see him, although he's come laden with gifts and clothes and gold and silver to give to the person for his healing. Do you think that a person with leprosy like this general has not prayed to God that it be taken away? I'm sure that there was prayer involved in this, even if it wasn't as conscious as the woman and her son who were on the verge of death. And the prophet won't even come out and talk to him. He just says, go bathe in the river Jordan 7 times. And the general hears this and he goes, "How stupid that is. I come from a country with beautiful rivers, and you want me to go in this mud hole?" Is basically what he's saying, because the Jordan was full of soot and wasn't a pretty river, very fast running and muddy. And he says, "You want me to do what?" And he was going to go back to Syria, and his servant told him, he says, "What if he had told you to do some great feat? Would you do that?" And he said, "Yes." And he says, "Well, what's so bad about bathing?" So he went and he bathed 7 times, and he was restored from his leprosy to his body being fit, and became a believer in the God of Israel. Almost every prayer that's answered in the Old Testament, or I should say all prayers answered in the Old Testament to non-believers, lead them to faith in God. The purpose of prayer for an unbeliever is to give God an opportunity to bring them to a knowledge of him. So God does hear prayers of sinners, but it's a very limited, narrow area that these prayers are in. They're the prayers of someone in distress that needs something to bring them into a relationship with the true God. That's the Old Testament way of talking about why God hears the prayers of non-Jews, Christians. In the New Testament, we find Jesus in Luke 11 introducing the Lord's Prayer and then discussing prayer and saying 2 reasons why God answers the prayers of non-Christians as well as Christians. The first is that God is like a judge. And he tells the story of a judge that a woman comes to him over and over and over, and he can't get rid of her. She keeps pleading with the judge to intervene on her behalf. And he finally breaks down and he does it. And he does it not because it's the right thing to do or because her cause is just or because she's right or wrong. It doesn't matter. He does it because he's tired of her persistence. And her persistence wins out. And we have Jesus healing a Syrophoenician woman who comes and begs for the scraps off the table, she says, that the dogs get the scraps off the table, so why shouldn't her son be healed by Jesus? And he finally says, yes, I will, because of her persistence. He finally yields. And so one reason that God hears prayers of people that are not his totally, that they're his children, is because of their persistence. And the second reason is because he, like a parent, God is our parent of all people, not just us, but all people. And as a parent, he says, a parent's not going to give their child an egg, who asks for an egg, a scorpion, or who asks for something else to eat, a rock. He says a parent's going to give their children what they need. And God gives his children what they need, whether it be Christian or not. The rain falls on everyone. It doesn't. If there was not one Christian in Arizona, do you think the monsoons would stop? Because that God sends twice in the summer, or that the winter rains would stop because there wasn't a Christian here to receive it? Because it rained before Christianity arrived here on the Indians, didn't it? Because God provides for all his people, all his children. But he particularly provides for us. Now we're coming back to what's so special about us. We have been purchased by Christ, by his death, his burial, his resurrection, and what we in America don't celebrate, his ascension. We have been marked. We have been given a responsibility, and we need God to hear us in prayer, because we are going to be praying for others as well as ourselves. We're going to be praying for the needs of the world as well as ourselves. We're going to be taking care of the needs of our families and friends, and may need God's help to do it. And he provides for us through prayer a way of asking for the things that we come up and need. So prayer is extremely important for Christians, but anyone who wants to say that prayer is only limited to Christians is missing the message. Because even though Christ died and rose, he still has a mission to save the world. And we're his hands and feet to do that. And part of accomplishing that is working in the lives of people to bring them to a knowledge that he is, that he exists, that he is the God in heaven, and that he can intervene in anyone's life. Not just ours, because we're Christian, but everyone's life. But with us, he's promised to intervene in many different ways, because we do know him already. We don't have to be caught up in just the emotional side that I've got to survive. God, help me survive. Provide me the rain that I need to grow the crops that I need. Provide me food. Our needs go beyond that, because we're responsible for the world. And God hears us and answers our prayer as we pray in his will to bring others to Christ outside of our little community, to expand that community. There was a time at the beginning of the 1900s when we believed we could bring in the second coming by forcing everyone to become Christian and bring about the second coming of Christ. But that's not what the message of Christ is. The message is to be faithful, to move ahead, to pray for those as God instills the needs in our hearts, and to do what God has appointed us to do in His will. What is His desire for our individual lives. So, let's not become too arrogant in the fact that we're Christians and that God only hears us, because that's not true, but God does hear us particularly. And He gives us the responsibility of praying in the Spirit and for the needs of ourselves and others.